Yeah, sure. Good morning. Welcome to this meeting of Seniors for Peace. And Robert Johansen is a member of the Crest Manor Church of the Brethren in South Bend. His latest book is Where the Evidence Leads, a Realistic Strategy for Peace and Human Security, which he will be talking about this morning. He was a 1962 graduate of Manchester College, received a PhD from Columbia in 1968. I'm going to leave a lot of this out, but he's also founding faculty member of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and for many years was director of doctoral studies. He is professor emeritus of political science and peace studies at Notre Dame, and most importantly, he was my lab through physics. So, Bob, we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you for inviting me here to meet with you. For me to be here is for me to come home. Brethren, community, and heritage, excellent professors taught me as an undergraduate at Manchester College. Actually, I see some of those in the audience. Some have already passed on. Excellent faculty that welcomed me back as an assistant professor, and of course, many wonderful student friends, both when I was an undergrad and then as a faculty member. So I'm very pleased to be here. In writing this book, which I must confess was no small effort, I tried to honor my calling as being some kind of neo-Anabaptist political scientist. There aren't many in the world. By that I mean I wanted to be responsible both to religious values on the one hand and to secular political goals on the other. In bringing ethics into an examination of international politics, where violence has normally been accepted as legitimate, my goal has been to enable us to be faithful to the teachings of Jesus and of other compassionate teachers and philosophers throughout history, while heeding the demands of practical reason, politics, sociology, economics, and law. I wanted to write a book that would enable me and others who would like to avoid killing anyone to have a solid place to stand, a place where we can live in ways that are morally responsible to the demands of prudent, practical politics, and simultaneously responsible to the ethic of not killing others. I think after all these years of study and thought, the path that makes such a life possible is to advance the rule of law throughout the United States and the world. This morning, I will discuss 8 points which cover the main arguments of my book. I promise I'll keep these fairly brief so that we have time for your questions. We're separated a bit more here physically than I know would be an ideal teaching or just conversational setting. But I sort of need the podium to be steady and to hold my notes, and there's a good mic here, so this is the way we'll do it. But please, let's keep in mind the informal give and take that we're going to have after I conclude my more formal beginning comments. And some of these points may seem abstract or that I'm moving too quickly, so don't hesitate to ask me to explain anything after I'm done. First point, we need to pay more attention, more careful attention to threats to our security. Every nation on earth now faces security threats that exceed any that we have faced in history. I'll mention only 2 here briefly to illustrate. We face catastrophic, now unmanageable disruption of our climate and our biosphere. We also face massive risks to human life and civilization from the possibility of violence by people who are not constrained by law or conscience. They might draw on destructive technologies ranging from nuclear and biological weapons of mass destructions to chemicals commonly used in fertilizers, to make explosives that could be delivered by suicide bombers, or other explosives that can now be delivered by many, many different actors using drones, planes, missiles, and satellites. In responding to these increasingly grave challenges, most of the world's main centers of power, which are entrenched in national governments and corporate boardrooms, they seem sort of unaware or maybe a bit uncaring about the scope and depth of these threats to human life. To be sure, they are taking small steps, and they are making many self-justifying statements to assure themselves and their constituents that they're making responsible decisions. But look at the unsatisfactory consequences of these very minor, feeble efforts. It leads us to wonder if they don't fully appreciate the nature and depth of the problems, or they're not speaking honestly about their failure to address them satisfactorily, either because of inability to do so or unwillingness to do so. If you reflect, you're aware there is no evident, strong effort in the world today to ensure human survival. There is none. You can't find it. There's a lot of evidence that people will sacrifice to help their country or their nation survive, but not much that they will sacrifice to achieve the survival of the human species or the survival of human civilization. Advocates of nuclear deterrence, for example, are prepared to destroy civilization to protect national security. At least that would be the claim if we have major nuclear war. Second point, we should take changes in international relations more seriously than we do. 4 of these changes worsen traditional security problems and increase the dysfunctionality of the existing international system, which scholars call a balance of power system, or you might call it a system of anarchy, relative anarchy, because there's no central governing power that can ensure that separate states will do what they should. In this militarized balance of power system, we face 4 really negative changes. First, we face increasing dangers from competing nationalisms armed with ever more dangerous weapons. Obviously, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are examples of threats to us. These countries perceive U.S. nationalism as threats to them. Second, in addition to these threats from other countries, we face growing threats from non-state actors. Some are willing to commit terrorist acts. Others are desperately pressing to immigrate, for example. A third changing reality is that military power has declining utility. It's useful mainly to make threats or to destroy, but it has not been useful in achieving desirable political outcomes. In Vietnam, even in Afghanistan after 20 years, in Iraq, in Iran, Syria, Libya, many other places. Powerful countries, great military strength, can't achieve desirable political outcomes through military means. Soviet Union and Russia learned that in Afghanistan as we have more recently. It's hard for great powers to learn that military power doesn't provide positive political outcomes very often. Fourth point I've already mentioned, we face rising non-military threats to security. Non-military threats to security, which a military response isn't adequate in order to address. Environmental deterioration is one of those, but chronic poverty is another. It's causing about 1.5 million unnecessary deaths every month, which cause great political instability. Now, on the positive side of the ledger of changes in international relations, there are 3 that are promising, but they're not very effectively utilized. First, to offset the growing decline in the utility of military power, we can expand the rule of law internationally. Second, we could strengthen global governance. This means building some new international institutions and making some old ones more effective. Third, we can increase the effectiveness of nonviolent direct action for resisting dictators, advancing social justice, and upholding human rights. I won't go into these in detail, but Suffice it to say that U.S. national security managers have downplayed all 7 of these changes in international political reality. They're ongoing changes, both negative and positive, and for that reason, they have failed to align U.S. power, which can do important good if it's employed for the proper goals, to meet desirable security goals. In practice, unfortunately, some of their policies have impeded the sustainability of peace, the effectiveness of international law, the prospects for economic justice, and the protection of our climate. U.S. policymakers have underestimated the dangers inherent in U.S. diplomatic unilateralism and in maintaining the current anarchic, militarized balance of power system as the dominant international system. Just to illustrate this point, while they are increasing their own military power within this international system, U.S. officials and members of Congress cannot really constrain the role of military power that's being accumulated by others. And while we modernize U.S. nuclear and conventional arsenals, we cannot modernize the international system of governance to employ more arms control and to limit the dangers that are posed by new weapons that are built by other countries. So we're perpetuating not only this militarized international system, but a global economic system in which inequities are increasing, which of course contribute to the threat of violence. We have been the prominent country in the world perpetuating an international economic system in which it now is true that 26 individuals, the richest 26 individuals in the world, possess as much wealth as that possessed by 4 billion of the world's poorest people. Although the current U.S. government is doing much better than its predecessor on the environment, most U.S. officials and corporations are not yet leading the way toward enforceable initiatives for environmental protection, which I'm convinced we need in order to avoid drastic harm to our environment. From time to time, the United States has ignored specific proposals made by others for developing new constraints on nuclear weapons, for putting constraints to prohibit or limit armed, or that is, attack drones, attack satellites, and other military technology. They mean well, yet they have not supported permanent upgrades to UN peacekeeping. They have continue to refuse to join the International Criminal Court, even though such initiatives could help to constrain some aggressive states and non-state actors. Which brings me to my third point. We are not seizing opportunities for building peace and security. These exist. We're not taking advantage of them. What I try to do in this book is show that if U.S. officials would work closely with other willing governments to implement what we know about peace-building strategies that do work, they and other forward-looking governments probably could prevent future wars and build sustainable peace with enhanced justice, human rights, and economic well-being for all, while still averting planetary environmental destruction. The problem isn't that we lack knowledge of what to do, it is that we are not doing what informed people know. rather than construct a more dependable peace based on an unflinching appraisal of security dangers and opportunities. Officials in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and the other major powers, they continue to rely primarily on the militarily competitive assumptions of a school of thought that's called political realism. It's a school of thought that they have been taught and they've been conditioned to believe, and of course it happens to justify their own power positions. You may have studied this yourself in school, I don't know, but it's a very widely accepted set of assumptions in political realism that the international system is what it is because it has to be that way, that it cannot change and will not change. And all we can do is wield our separate sovereignty and military power to uphold our separate nationalism against competing nationalisms. So, as a result, now that the future of human civilization is threatened because great powers keep insisting on solving global problems with national solutions, which simply will not work, our whole human civilization is coming under threat. This is one reason that way back 1945, Albert Einstein said after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. Einstein encouraged us then to recognize that global problems require globally inclusive decision-making and enforcing mechanisms. Which leads to my fourth point. We should reduce international anarchy by changing the international political system. Instead of staying on the path of political realism, which emphasizes ever higher levels of military preparedness in an international system mistakenly assumed to be unchangeable, this is expected, by the way, to go on forever. And even though it does, we're expected to be able to live as a human civilization, despite the ever-increasing destructive capabilities. These assumptions simply perpetuate this system and make its change unlikely. Keep in mind, it's this system that enabled Vladimir Putin to rise to power. He rose to power, he's, as you know, KGB trained person, rose to power in Russia at a time that it was unclear if it would become more democratic or more authoritarian because of this military competition that he used to strengthen nationalist and military support for him some years ago. So it's this system that has given us Putin, in a way. It's also this system that has enabled Putin to justify an attack on Ukraine. Because at home, he justifies it as fear that Ukraine is going to be an outpost for NATO, the Western alliance. So it is, in a very real way, the assumptions of political realism and this international political system that enables things to happen that then we cannot solve once they have gotten underway. Well, in this book, I propose an alternative theory of international relations, which I call empirical realism, because it emphasizes hard empirical facts, not ideology that says the international system cannot be changed. Empirical realism shows that anarchy in the international system can be reduced in order to increase everyone's security. Although he didn't use my current terminology, Einstein embodies being an empirical realist. institutionalizing multilateral peace and security can be a wiser goal than maximizing U.S. military power, because doing the latter encourages destabilizing military rivalries, lawless expansion of destructive technologies, and unnecessary violence. Which leads to my fifth and most paradoxical point, which is to achieve national security, we need to emphasize human security. Earlier in history, this wouldn't have been necessary. At this stage of history, it is necessary. I mean security for everyone on our planet, not just security for ourselves. This means focusing on building effective multilateral institutions that can enable all human beings to meet their basic needs. And this can lead to more political stability. This approach revolutionizes, turns on its head, thinking about national security by encompassing it directly in a human security framework and shifting U.S. security policy away from a preoccupation with expanding military power toward increasing human security and institutional governing strength for everybody on the planet. Which leads to my sixth point. We should implement the correlates of peace, or what some would call even the causes of peace. That's the most effective way to increase security. My synthesis in this book of peace and security studies research suggests there are 6 important correlates, which I'll run through just very briefly. First, it should be obvious, but it's not. It's necessary to acknowledge and address all nations' security fears, not simply our own. All nations' security fears have to be addressed. That includes, of course, those of our adversaries. And this is the big problem with Russia in Ukraine. Second, we should emphasize human security no less than national security, thereby enabling all people in the world to meet basic needs. Security should be for people, really, not just for national governments and the elites that run them. And initiatives in this direction will increase political support worldwide for a more stable system of world law. It's no panacea, it's not easy, but that would be a long-term effect. Third correlate is the principle of reciprocity. Reciprocity in rights and duties for all international relationships. This is probably the most commonly understood conflict resolution principle in the world. Every culture in the world understands reciprocity. Not insisting on rights for oneself you don't grant for others, or impose duties on others you don't accept yourself. For example, it's difficult to be effective in insisting that Vladimir Putin obey the law against aggression if we did not accept a reciprocal obligation when we invaded Iraq. Or we cannot be effective in leading a world campaign to insist that Putin obey the International Criminal Court's law prohibiting war crimes as long as we continue to refuse to join the International Criminal Court designed to enforce that law. We're just weakened enormously in asking for that law to be enforced when we're not a party to the treaty that establishes the court to enforce it. Take another example of reciprocity shortcomings. Let me state it differently. We want Iran and other countries not to develop nuclear weapons, and I certainly share that goal. For that reason, U.S. senators should ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And if we want North Korea and Iran to allow the IAEA to monitor their nuclear facilities, as we reasonably should expect and demand, the United States should also invite the IAEA to inspect our nuclear facilities and those of every nuclear power on Earth. That would be reciprocity. Fourth correlate, equity. If we do reciprocity, we need to do much more to implement the principle of equity in political, economic, and environmental affairs. Right now, the richest 10% of the world's population takes home 75% of the world's income. The poorest 10% receive 1/4 of 1%. The gap between the richest and the poorest has been increasing for over 200 years in this international economic system. The ratio is now 150 to 1. Of the richest 1/5 compared to the poorest 1/5 of the world's people. Such inequities are not morally justifiable, nor are they politically useful. This inequity is causing us huge problems. Fifth correlate is to expand the rule of law in the international community. Helps everyone benefit from more predictability if this international system would have a greater degree of law in it. Another example of this is we want the Chinese Navy to obey the law in the Pacific. I certainly strongly endorse that idea. But it makes me ask, why have U.S. senators refused for 41 years to ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty? Where's their interest in promoting the rule of law? 168 other countries have ratified it. The sixth and final correlate is we need to build democratic global governance to enable the formation and enforcement of international laws essential for human security, to help institutionalize peace, and to enable all people to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. There are both negative benefits and positive benefits from promoting more global governance. National security policy can be transformed into human security policy, I claim, because most U.S. security problems can be more effectively dealt with if they're addressed as problems of global governance, rather than as problems to be solved by redeploying U.S. military power. Just think about it. That's true of terrorism, isn't it? We can't prevent terrorism just by being the most powerful military country in the world. We need help. We need intelligence. We need cross-border cooperation among police. We need this to be shared by every country in the world. We don't get there by being a big military power. We get there by promoting global governance. Over time, law can be enforced using less and less violent means as a society evolves, whether that society is national or global. Whenever the society gains a higher and higher degree of what I call governability, that's the ability to be governable. U.S. society now is less governable than it may have been a decade ago because it's more highly polarized. So if you want to increase the quality of governability of world society, what do? You implement the correlates of peace that I've just mentioned. My seventh general point, 7 out of 8, and I've got to be moving there quickly, so we have question time. We can and must bridle military power with global governance. We can strengthen and democratize international institutions, and that may be the most effective action the United States is able to take to reduce armed conflict and foster human freedom throughout the world. We can design global institutions that can be built now without incurring unacceptable risks, yet which will enable more far-reaching structural changes down the road that can safely build more systemic change. I'll just mention in passing some examples. We can create a standing, individually recruited, multinational UN peacemaking service to prevent Rwandan-like genocides and small-scale violent conflicts. We could establish a comprehensive UN monitoring system for the purpose of international law enforcement. We could expand the oversight of the International Atomic Energy Agency of all countries' weapons of mass destruction. We could create a World Environmental Security Council with legally binding authority. We could expand economic and educational opportunities to end chronic global poverty and joblessness, and to enable universal public education for all girls and boys throughout the world. We could establish a democratic global people's parliamentary assembly, and at almost no cost, we could provide a secure internet system for communication and possible joint action by all legislators throughout the world who've been democratically elected in every national parliament or Congress of the world. Eighth point, we should join hands with transnational social movements that aim to transform the balance of power and implement the correlates of peace. To promote change, concerned citizens can withdraw their support from national leaders and policies that don't serve the common good of humanity, and work instead to implement a global grand strategy that would serve legitimate U.S. security interests by helping to uphold human dignity for all. In closing, just let me summarize by saying, by addressing all nations' security fears, by emphasizing human security that encompasses national security, by respecting reciprocity, increasing equity, expanding the role of international law, and growing democratic global governance, we and other forward-looking governments can increase the governability of the world. As that happens, a reformed international system could then be more effectively employed to address dangers, real dangers, that are posed by hyper-independent, dangerously armed states, or by terrorists and populist extremists. Today's militarized balance of power system could be transformed into a more dependable global governing system able to channel transnational political, economic, religious, and other influences to guide states' conduct towards serving the common good. Where the evidence leads, whether it's in this book or not, look at the evidence. Where the evidence leads, it shows, I'm quite sure, that relying on national military power to achieve U.S. security is likely to backfire in the short run and fail in the long run. And that a global strategy for human security, with U.S. security folded into it, would be much more likely to succeed. Let me stop there and listen to your questions.
While you're thinking, are there any organizations, non-governmental organizations maybe, that it would be really good for, that we could support, that could begin to work on some of these issues?
Yes, the question is, are there non-governmental organizations?
Or which ones are best, maybe?
Yeah, well, the question is to evaluate, I guess, non-government organizations. I think it's very important now myself to support human rights groups like Amnesty International or I've forgotten the name of the other of human rights that are working for the promotion of human rights internationally. I say that because the emphasis of human security is to ensure that all human beings have their basic needs met. I think that's essential for increasing political stability and also for building worldwide political community that is necessary to support increasing global governance. So I think I would recommend those. There's also a lot of work being done. It's certainly a minority, but a lot of work being done on this question of global governance. And there's a website called Global Governance Forum, one word, or no spaces at least, which refers to efforts worldwide that are being undertaken by social movement groups, some of which are mainly national, but some of which are transnational. But I would place the emphasis, I guess, on human rights protection and growth, partly because there's always a problem in building support for political action that may become violent and then somewhat counterproductive. But that isn't true of human rights organizations as a rule. And I think it's important to emphasize the goal of not killing in trying to promote the democratization of national or international decision making. So that's my brief answer.
Other questions?
Is there any indication that since you wrote this book, you're any closer to getting some of the things you have in the book done?
A good question. I think the answer briefly is no. On the other hand, a more complicated answer might find some signs of greater hope because more people are aware of how seriously we are threatened with some of these problems. But I would hasten to add, if there is now a bit more awareness and movement, I wouldn't claim it's because of the book. So I don't want to make any false connections there. But the main effort in the book actually is to synthesize a lot of the research that has been done in recent years, past decade especially, by others. So there is a growing awareness of some of the problems that I point to, that I mentioned at first, the need to pay more attention to security threats. I think there is some progress on that point. We're much better aware. And the United States, as I said, is doing much more on the environment than its predecessor. And however, whatever you think about the Pope Francis has made one of the more progressive statements about environmental issues of any internationally known public figure. I mean, it's a very positive statement about what we need to do to protect the environment. So I think awareness is growing. The problem is that the problems are accelerating in their consequences so that it's much harder to resolve in a way that's relatively cost effective. I mean, every year that we go by, increasing carbon emissions makes it harder to reduce those carbon emissions to a level that will enable us to save the climate. Human beings are not very good at anticipating problems in the future and taking action in time to address them when the efforts to address them can be more effective. This, of course, is the classic reason, if you think in evolutionary terms, this is the classic reason that species become extinct. They don't adjust rapidly enough to changes that they face. Even something big and mighty like the dinosaur became extinct because it couldn't adjust. Humans have the capacity to think and therefore anticipate problems that they might adjust to. And as I said, one of the most frustrating parts of writing this book is the conviction that we have knowledge that would enable us to solve our problems, but we're not using it. Other questions? Tim?
So much appreciate that summary, Bob. And what I'm left with is wondering if you could talk with us about one, I guess, opinion, and another I would consider principle.
Mhm.
The opinion is my sense, perhaps it's cynicism, that the lack of political will for policymakers in this country and around the world to take security threats more seriously is because they don't feel any pressure, any need to change. My rather cynical view is that at least in this country, most of our public policymakers are concerned only about one thing, and that is maintaining their position of power. That primarily means keeping a congressional seat, for example. So that lack of political will can be contrasted with one of the most basic principles of nonviolent social change, and that's the concept that power is pluralistic. How can we force policymakers in this country and around the world to take security threats more seriously by organizing in such a way that they understand that they will lose their positions of power unless they change the policies that are threatening humanity?
Thank you, Tim. I agree completely with your assumptions and the way you've laid out the problem. And your answer, or others in the room answer, would be as good as mine on how to convince people in power that they need to make changes. I mean, this assumption, I'm reminded immediately as I hear you speak, this assumption is what Martin Luther King addressed with his letter from Birmingham jail, because you might recall that was a response to a public statement by clergy, other clergy in the city where he was demonstrating, mainly white, but they were saying the way to get to racial equality isn't to increase tension. And King says in his letter, he's convinced that some tension is needed to promote change. Very careful to say nonviolent tension, nonviolent tension. And he clearly spoke against violence. I think the analogy applies to our current situation. And it's why I see a synthesis finally at these late years in my life, a synthesis between the earlier effort of people in Anabaptist tradition, especially, people who were committed to nonviolence. For generations, we have felt it could be useful to show an example of how to live by not killing others. And so there's been a refusal to participate in military conflict. I would argue now you could make the argument that the best way to demonstrate to others that we think the present system must be changed is to refuse to participate in violence, not simply on principle because we're following Jesus, but out of prudent politics. It's the best way to convince people they have to rely less on the gun and more on the law. I mean, the world's not going to change suddenly. to being supporting military power to being pacifist. I'm not expecting that. But I do think the only way the political powers will begin to get the message they have to do something differently is if they're forced to do this, because people get so unwilling to support certain military activity. And the most obvious place to begin, I think, is to say we don't want to be defended by nuclear weapons, period, no matter what. The United States could easily give up its nuclear weapons. It would still have enormous conventional military power. I'm not saying you'd have to be pacifist to give up nuclear weapons. All you'd have to do is say, oh, we prefer to rely on conventional weapons rather than nuclear. And it should be in the forefront of arms control initiatives that seek to constrain the use of nuclear power, rather than keeping the doors open for using nuclear weapons even first. The U.S. has always insisted it has the right to use nuclear weapons first in conflict. You know, that's just a ridiculous request, in my view. So I think more and, we should organize politically and try to work with others who are interested in moving the political goals of Congress in a direction that we favor. Definitely, I believe in coalition building with others who don't share all of my views. At the same time, I think we who see a different way of living should feel confident that we're on a politically prudent path by making our own conduct consistent with our own ethics. Some people won't like it, but it still is about the only effective way. And you may have a better answer to this, Tim, than I do, but I think we build coalitions with those who have somewhat different views, but it's going the right direction. But then we also engage in our own personal conduct in a way that makes it crystal clear where I personally stand. I think Stan has a question.
I don't think it's as much a question as just a comment, because I think there are paths where what you are talking about and what you are writing about are already evident in the activity of the church globally. Because the Church's Committee on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches, which represents more than just the Anabaptist tradition, is actively engaging, especially after the 11th World Assembly, in engaging the United Nations on the new order for peacemaking and the new emphasis that it's putting on the rising implications of statelessness that are affecting huge populations of our earth. My frustration with it is that we have to hear about it to know that there are people of faith, a broad variety of faith, including the Russian Orthodox, who are involved in calling for a global effort through the United Nations to enter a new era of peacemaking. And so I just need to name that as a viable place for us to engage, and also to ask the church to be more prolific at sharing the information of what it is involved in. Our seminary president, Jeff Carter, has been an active participant in the Church's Committee on International Affairs and speaking globally to the issues of peacemaking. So I think there are venues where we are already engaged that we ought to be knowing about and supporting and encouraging. Most recently, the CCIA, as it's referred to, has been invited by the United Nations to be a constant hearer of the nation's comments about the new age of peacemaking. And so the church, in this large body's voice, is being actively employed by the UN to be involved. And that's important to me. I think it's important to all of us that the voice of faith, not only Christian faith, but multi-faith voices are being asked to consider the new age of peacemaking and the issue of statelessness around our globe.
Thank you, Stan. I agree.
Yeah, thank you. That helped take care of one of my questions. But the other one, Bob, is as you described the empirical realism and various ways in which that works itself out, you made the comment that where women participate in decision-making positions, there tends to be less conflict and more movement toward justice. I thought it would be helpful maybe if you could reflect on that as you see that happening in our own country and maybe around the world.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, that's a very interesting point. There are some research studies that make it quite clear to me that there is a correlation. Again, I'll call it that rather than a cause. I don't want to overstate the connections, but there's clearly a correlation between an increase in the number of women involved in three things: in negotiating peace settlements, in elected to members of parliaments or legislatures, and then also exerting executive leadership. The increase in the number of women tends to result in an increase in the degree to which peace is maintained after violence within a war-torn society. And there are many, there's a lot of conjecture about the reasons for this, but most of the reasons have to do with the familiarity of women with trying to take human needs very seriously, often more directly than some men, and also the need to collaborate and cooperate in order to achieve humanitarian goals, whereas men may emphasize competitiveness. Now, please don't misunderstand. All of us know women who have been just as strong in promoting warlike reactions as some men. And we know some men that have been just as skilled at promoting negotiation and peace as some of the best women. So I don't want to stereotype the gender, but I do think the evidence is important. And this is one way in which the world might, I think definitely would, improve the degree to which peace would be valued and would be implemented, which would be to increase the proportion of women in leadership positions in society. And this means political positions. And it's no accident that if you look at the proportion of women, let's say in the legislatures or parliaments of European democracies, the ones that have the most women have been the most interested in promoting peace. Did you want to say more about that, Larry? Or yeah. There are lots of research studies that do offer hope. These goes back to Ron's question, offer hope of progress. And I think this is clearly something that's coming. I mean, I think there will be a slow but long-term increase in the number of women in leadership positions. What I wonder about is if the masculinization of women will occur as fast as the feminization of the political process, or faster. I don't know. But I'm trusting enough of these research studies to be very hopeful that this is a very positive sign. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks for sharing with us today. My question is about hopefulness as well.
Yeah.
Obviously, the rate of death and destruction that we've seen in Ukraine over the past year is just very heavy to deal with.
Yeah.
Are there any paths that you think deserve some hopefulness as we go forward to ending that death and destruction?
A good question, very hard to answer in a short time, because as you know, once a house is on fire, to try to stop the fire and not allow further fire damage is very difficult. But of course, that's what we need to do. I have a set of proposals for what to do. Some are short-term and some are long-term. Some are to end the war in Ukraine. Others are to prevent future Ukraines from occurring. The latter problems are much easier to address, I think, because we know what to do in order to make world society more peaceful. We don't always know exactly what to do to stop this particular war. But the longer term things would be that the United States should get its own house in order, make sure it's ratifying treaties that it can, that it's joining courts that it can, that it is requiring its military practices to follow the Geneva Accords and the international laws regulating the rules of warfare and so on. The shorter term are harder and maybe what you would like to focus on. So let me say a couple of things about that. Once two countries are fighting like these are, I think we have to start by trying to identify what can reasonably be offered to each side without sacrificing the other side's fundamental needs, as opposed to their fundamental wants. Now, this is a subjective question to some extent, but what can we offer here? We ought to offer everything that we can to get the violence to stop. But I point out, just as a lot of sacrificing is going on now to continue the war, there's going to have to be some sacrificing to end the war and continue the peace. It's a different kind, but it's still going to require some compromises and sacrifices. I think in this case, Ukraine should give up joining NATO, possibly even give up joining the European Union in return for a Russian ceasefire and withdrawal. Ukraine may need to commit itself permanently to being a neutral country. And I mention this because I don't know if any of you remember after World War II, Russian army was occupying all of Austria. Allies hadn't gotten there. We divided the occupation of Germany after the war with sectors for Russia, for Britain, France, and the United States, and then 3 Western countries unified their sector. And then finally, all of Germany was reunified. Austria, not so. How did we get the Russian army out of Austria? Promised Austria would be neutral country. When Stalin heard that, he took the Russian forces out. It was formally agreed to, of course, formally agreed to, international law, international treaty. Maybe that's in the cards for Ukraine, because I don't know how much Putin has believed it and how much it's cynical. But I do know Putin has enabled that war to occur because he has spoken about the threats to Russian security by the eastward expansion of the NATO alliance and by the deployment of military power from the West in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and so on. And while I don't agree that the West is about to attack Russia, remember, one of the correlates of peace is take seriously the fears of others. I think this is a legitimate fear, and it's a real fear. And if you look at the diplomatic record, George Kennan, who was the architect of containment of the Soviet Union, strong U.S. nationalist, anti-communist, he had an op-ed editorial in the New York Times pleading with the U.S. diplomatic establishment not to expand NATO to the east. He said, if you do, it's going to fan the fires of Russian nationalism. It's going to help authoritarian people come to power. It's going to undermine democracy in Russia, and it's going to lead to a resurgence of the Cold War. You can look it up. It is cited, by the way, in my book. And there were lots of U.S. former diplomats, senior diplomats, who agreed with Kennan on this. And again, as I say, I don't expect the United States or NATO to attack Russia. You've got to keep in mind, the Russians have a different perspective. And just as the United States would not allow Russian missiles to be in Cuba, you can understand why the Russians might be fearful of Western armaments in Ukraine or even close to Ukraine. So that's the direction I think we have to go to end this. And I would hope that NATO would commit itself not to expanding further eastward, and it should renounce increasing military deployments of weapons close to Russian borders. And again, the reciprocity here is Austria, we did that, and in Cuba, we didn't allow Russian power there. We shouldn't expect US power to be close to Russia. Dean, are we out of time?
Yeah, I think we are. Thank you very much for those questions. After the meeting, there's a book club that asked to meet with Bob for a while, and we're going to kind of circle up here in front. If some of the rest of you would like to join that, feel free to join us. Bob has a couple of articles from Messenger that he's published there in the back, and also there's a synopsis of the book back there. And Bob brought some books with him too. So if you would like to get a copy of the book, I don't know, not sure how many you brought. I spoke for one already, but let's give Bob a hand.